Hello, everyone. My name is Kirsten, and this is my project on crossing concrete, Florida panthers, and urban growth. Today's lecture is focusing on the Florida panther and how urban expansion in South Florida affects its survival. We will explore panther ecology, major urban threats, movement, and mortality patterns, as well as management strategies used to reduce human wildlife conflict. This topic highlights how large carnivores persist or struggle in increasingly urbanized landscapes. The Florida panther is a subspecies of cougar and one of the most endangered mammals in the United States. Panthers are solitary, wide-ranging predators that require large connected territories to hunt, disperse, and find mates. Adult males can require hundreds of square miles of habitat, which makes them especially vulnerable to habitat loss and fragmentation. So, historically, Florida panthers ranged throughout the southeastern United States. Today, their range is largely restricted to South Florida. This is primarily in and around Big Cypress National Preserve, the Everglades, and surrounding public and private lands. Urban development has dramatically reduced available habitat, pushing panthers into smaller, more fragmented areas. Rapid population growth in South Florida has increased road density, suburban development, and land conversion. These changes fragment habitat and create barriers to panther movement. Fragmentation limits dispersal, increases human-wildlife conflict, and contributes to population isolation. This is a major challenge for long-term population viability. The map shown here is from the article, How Much is Enough?, which was one of the required readings for this module. This map highlights how development and land use patterns fragment the landscape and limit the amount of suitable habitat available for panthers. When we compare this to the species status assessment, we can also see mapped conservation lands across South Florida. While there are protected areas like Big Cypress and Everglades National Park, these lands are not fully connected. This creates isolated habitat patches, which makes it difficult for panthers to safely move between them. So before moving forward, it's important to define a few key terms. Habitat fragmentation occurs when large, continuous habitats are broken into smaller, isolated habitats. Wildlife corridors are connected areas of habitat that allow animals to move safely between patches. Edge effects refer to changes in environmental conditions that occur at the boundary between natural habitats and developed areas. These often increase risks for wildlife. So, Florida panthers rely on landscape connectivity to maintain genetic diversity and population health. Roads, fences, and development interrupt natural movement patterns. When panthers cannot safely disperse, interbreeding and population decline become more likely. Maintaining connectivity is therefore a central goal for panther conservation. One of the leading causes of panther death is vehicle collisions. As roads intersect panther habitat, the risk of mortality increases, particularly in high traffic corridors. Road mortality not only affects individual panthers, but can have population level impacts, especially in a small endangered population. This interactive map that I'm about to show you from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission shows the exact locations of documented panther mortalities across the state. So let's take a look. So, as you can see, many of these deaths are clustered along major roadways, which vehicle collisions are the leading cause of death in Florida panthers. And this spatial pattern clearly shows how road density impacts survival. This tool helps wildlife managers identify high-risk areas to prioritize where mitigation strategies like wildlife crossings are needed. To address these challenges, wildlife agencies use several mitigation strategies. These include wildlife underpasses paired with fencing, land acquisition for habitat corridors, and transportation planning that considers wildlife movement. These approaches aim to reduce road mortality while maintaining habitat connectivity. According to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, habitat loss and fragmentation remain the primary threats to Florida panther recovery. Research from How Much Is Enough, the required reading in this module, shows that panthers require large, connected landscapes to maintain a viable population, meaning conservation efforts must focus not just on protecting land, but connecting it. Without these strategies, isolated populations face increased risks of interbreeding and long-term decline. Wildlife underpasses and overpasses have been shown to reduce panther road deaths and encourage safe crossings. Images and maps in this lecture show how these structures are strategically placed in high-risk areas. Their success depends on proper design, location, and of course, long-term maintenance. This map combines major roadways in Florida with the Florida Wildlife Corridor. What becomes clear is that the major interstates like I-75 cut directly through critical habitat areas, creating bottleneck effects. These increase bottleneck effects force panthers to cross dangerous roadways in order to access habitat, and then they have an increased mortality risk. Studies and conservation reports show that wildlife underpasses and crossings significantly reduce these risks by providing safe passage across roads. In areas where crossings and fencing are installed, wildlife vehicle collisions have been reduced, improving both animal survival and driver safety. These structures are most effective when placed in known movement corridors, which is why spatial data, like we were looking at earlier, is so important when planning. Florida panther conservation involves multiple stakeholders, including the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, transportation agencies, urban planners, and local communities. Effective management requires collaboration between conservation science and urban development planning. Florida panther conservation requires coordination across multiple groups. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for federal protection and recovery planning under the Endangered Species Act. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, they track panther movements, population, and collect mortality data. Transportation agencies like the Florida Department of Transportation design and implement wildlife crossings and road mitigation strategies. Urban planners and local governments influence land use decisions that determine where development occurs. Together, these stakeholders must collaborate to balance conservation goals with continued population growth. Balancing human growth with wildlife conservation is complex. Urban expansion provides housing, infrastructure for people, but it also places pressures on endangered species. Understanding these trade offs helps conservation professionals develop realistic, science based solutions rather than one sided approaches. One of the biggest challenges in panther conservation is balancing development with habitat protection. As human populations grow, especially here in the state of Florida, unfortunately, there is an increased demand for housing, roads, and infrastructure. However, expanding into undeveloped areas reduces available habitat and increases fragmentation. The research from How Much is Enough, the required reading for this module, emphasizes that maintaining large connected landscapes is critical for panther survival, which often conflicts with development goals. This creates trade-offs where decision makers must weigh economic growth against long-term ecological sustainability. Effective conservation requires strategic planning, such as directing development away from key habitats and investing in connectivity solutions for the future. So, in summary, Florida panthers are highly vulnerable to urban expansion due to their large space requirements and sensitivity to fragmentation. Roads and development increase mortality and reduce connectivity, but targeted management strategies can mitigate these impacts. Studying this case helps us understand broader challenges of large carnivore conservation in urbanizing landscapes. The information presented in this lecture is based on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Species Status Assessment, the article How Much is Enough, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission data, and the National Geographic's Path of the Panther, which again, I highly recommend everyone going to watch. These sources provide both scientific and real-world perspectives on conservation. Thank you so much for watching this lecture, and I really hope that you enjoyed this module.